Today's brown bag is Van Kane and Derek Churchill, here from the UW and other consulting services. They have done a bunch of nifty work with LiDAR up and down the West Coast, from the PNW down through the Sierra Nevada. Originally out of the Franklin lab, but kind of branching since then and all that. So going to tell us about the latest and greatest on using LiDAR for research and inventory and all that good stuff. Without further ado.
Okay, I'm Van Kane. I'm an assistant research professor at the University of Washington. I'm using LiDAR now since about 2005. And originally I was working with Landsat with Forest, and people kept saying, you got to look at this LiDAR stuff. And I kept saying, it can't be that good. It's got to be bullshit. Got into it and it was actually good. It doesn't do everything. I'll talk about some of that. But compared to Landsat or virtually any other remote sensing method, LiDAR gives you higher fidelity, and it's across the entire landscape. So you can zoom in at any place you want. Now, I'd like to just get a sense, how many people here have worked with LiDAR or are familiar with LiDAR? Oh, okay, so some of my intro slides then may not tell you all that much. And how many of you work with forests, forestry, habitat? Great, okay. So the way we have this divided up, I'm going to go give some general background for LiDAR. Since you guys know more, I'll try to add more than what's on the slides. And then Derek's going to give some examples of use for ecological forestry and assessment. So first, a little bit about us. We have a program that Derek and I both run jointly at the University of Washington that we call Forest Grams, Forest Resilience and Restoration on Multiple Scales. And so what we really focus on is, given all the challenges that forests have today, climate change, a history of fire suppression in many places, droughts, insects, everything else, how do we help make forest resilient? How to help managers plan, select, plan, and monitor restoration projects, and at multiple scales. As I said before, LiDAR has this almost unique ability in remote sensing. You can zoom into an individual tree if you want, and you can get very high accuracy measurements across entire landscapes. And so our real goal is to make LiDAR just a part of the forest and forest ecology toolkit. So there's a number of us, myself and Derek, Bob McGoy, who is a researcher with the PNW Research Station. We have two graduate students, Sean and Miles, and we have an analyst, Jonathan. So you guys all, just in case there's someone who didn't raise their hand when I asked if you worked with LiDAR before. Basic idea is you have essentially a laser rangefinder that just happens to put up to a few 100,000 pulses per second in a plane, sweeps back and forth to give you measurements in this direction, and the plane's motion forward scans out the landscape. The plane flies back and forth to cover arbitrarily large areas. There are acquisitions that occur over months. They are so large. And in fact, on the East Coast and in the South, a number of entire states have been flown. Several countries in Europe have been totally flown. Here in the West Coast, we're not quite as caught up. So you can either have the point cloud, and, we're working on two presentations together. So I can't remember which is in which presentation. So basically, all the LiDAR return is the laser pulse goes out, it hits something which reflects back, and through a lot of computational resources, we get a measurement in XYZ space that's accurate to, about something like this relative to the true surface of the Earth. And all of them, a lot of them together describe a tree or describe a stand of trees. And you can also get a canopy surface model, which is simply a fitted surface. It's a great way to look at the structure of the outer canopy surface. the trees that are we call immediately dominant. If there's nothing between that tree and God, the LiDAR can see it. It's reflected in the canopy surface model. And while we do not work with ground models other than to a little bit for slope topography and to normalize tree heights, the vast majority of use of LiDAR in natural resources is for ground models, hydrology, landslides, geomorphology, all of that. So LiDAR captures differences that we can see. These happen to be examples out of Yosemite, unburned, low, medium, and high severity fire. They look different, and LiDAR captures that. And we can use a whole bunch of quantitative measurements to actually measure what these stands look like, map them across entire landscapes, and then analyze them. Winter was great. Okay, just some examples. So here is a 30 by 30 meter area. Actually, I took a narrow slice, just a 30 meter long slice within a forest.
There we go. Okay, I won't touch
And
this.
just some ideas of some measurements that come directly out of the most basic analysis of the LiDAR data. First of all, you usually have a height cutoff below which you are not measuring the canopy, so you simply ignore returns below that height cutoff. We use 2 meters. Some people use breast height, but it excludes all the returns that hit the ground or hit shrubs or coarse woody debris. So P95 is a good approximation for dominant tree height. You don't hit the absolute maximum, but you also excluding that bird, which happens to have been flying right over the treetops that the LiDAR saw. Standard deviation, a great measure of how complex the canopy structure is. You look at tree farms, very low standard deviation of return heights. Look at a nice piece of old growth, you get a very large return. You get mean height. It turns out that the 25th percentile height of the returns above the height cutoff turns out to be a really good measurement for height to live crown. If you look at regressions, that often comes out as either the only or the most dominant measurement. In canopy cover, LiDAR, there's many, many ways to measure canopy cover. But LiDAR has a nice advantage. You get a consistent measurement over your entire landscape. And the simplest measurement, there's other ways of doing this, simply take the ratio of all the points above your height cutoff, so you say that those are canopy, divided by the total number of returns. A very simple, robust measurement that you can do over very large areas. And as we work with a lot of people who work with habitat, coming up with a consistent measure is really, really important. We're doing a lot of work with people with spotted owls in California, and they are all tied up in the fact that different field teams measure cover in different ways. Different measurements from LiDAR give inconsistent measurements of canopy cover, and they are legally and regulatorily responsible for managing the forest to maintain certain canopy covers. LiDAR gives you a very nice way to do this. Canopy surface model I went over before is simply a fitted surface over the outermost LiDAR points. The algorithm that we use, simply we divide up the area into about 3/4 meter grid cells, so half a square meter, and what's the highest return height in each one, and that's the canopy surface model. And for some applications, we do some smoothing. So an example of where you can use that is in tree identification. So you take the canopy surface model, there's a whole bunch of algorithms you can use. We use a fairly simple one that we don't think gets screwed up as you go over a natural forest, which has a wide range of different forest types. So we can then come out with what we call tree approximate objects. And on the next slide, I'll show you why we call them tree approximate objects and not simply trees. But you can see here that, yeah, this looks like a tree. We also then, for our analyses, is we group these TAOs, or tree approximate objects, or we assign the maximum height to all the grid cells associated with that tree. And then we do a lot of analysis with tree clumps and openings, and we simply break the trees into height strata. And we use several height strata. You could use even ones every 10 meters, for example. So the reason I call these tree approximate objects, and this is from the work by our graduate student, Sean Geronimo, and he and another grad student went off and stem mapped 19 quarter-hectare plots in the Sierra, selected to go everything from very young, even height stands to very complex old growth. So we wanted to get as wide of a diversity as possible to see how well you really measure the accuracy. And basically this black line is the mean accuracy by relative height. So if you have a stand where the trees are 50 meters tall, 100% is 50 meters. If you happen to have a stand where your tallest tree is 25 meters tall, the relationship still holds. Roughly at about 60% of the tree heights, relative tree heights and greater, you're at 80 to 100% accuracy in detecting the big trees. Our method, virtually, well, all published methods, except for those that are very highly tuned for very specific kinds of forest, have the same kind of accuracy. So if you want to look at your dominant trees, this kind of a method is a great way to analyze forest, and where's one we're using. Now this red line here is actually the number of trees by relative height. And so you can see for all the little trees in the stands, we and every other method that does individual tree recognition misses it. So you cannot take this and throw this into FES, grow your forest. That's why we call them tree approximate objects. This is a model of your dominant trees in stands. So then how do you take these measurements and extend them across an entire landscape? Here I have a point cloud. We can take canopy cover, we can take P95 for tree, the dominant tree height. We can do this by the area in each class of TAO. But we simply divide up the area and map it as a raster over the entire area. And as I've said before, LiDAR is great because it is naturally enables very multi-scale analyses. You can take the LiDAR returns that are only over your plots and analyze your plots that way. You can do it by grid cell. And so if you're just looking at plots or individual grid cells, you're probably going to be looking at the point cloud measurements. You might take measurements off the Canopy surface model or perhaps from tree approximate objects. If you're looking at stands or project areas, you're probably going to be working with the Canopy surface model. We do a lot of our work that way here when we go and analyze forests for either habitat or for restoration, because your dominant trees, you can see the gaps, you can see where your big trees are. Or the Canopy surface model. Well, for whole landscapes, you can either use the rasters or you can summarize things by polygons. So if you have stand polygons, you can take all the values in the rasters within the stand, within each polygon, and take the mean, the maximum, whatever analysis you want to apply to it. So just some key uses of LiDAR. I mentioned the ground models, the number one use of LiDAR in natural resource management. Forest inventory, we do some forest inventory when we're working with an agency that asks us to do this as part of another analysis. It's not the main focus of our work. If you're interested in forest inventory, go talk to Jacob. He is one of the experts in this field, so you guys are well covered here. And I think Derek will mention a little bit more about how inventory is done, but not much. And then there's all kinds of things what I call for structural assessment or mapping. It can be ecological management, planning, monitoring. You want to restore certain conditions or accelerate certain conditions in your forest. Habitat characterization and mapping. If you want to analyze the effects of fire, drought, insects on your forest. Characterizing fuels or mapping fuels. So this is where we put our emphasis, is all down in here under that Forest RAMS project. And so we have a whole bunch of different projects that we're doing, primarily with National Forest in either the Pacific Northwest here or in this area of Nevada, and with several parks. But we do structural mapping to support landscape restoration. We're working, as I said, on projects with spotted owl in California, also with the Pacific Fisher. Landscape evaluations for fire. How has fire, and this is really coming out of a lot of our work in the Sierra, although we'll start doing a lot of this on the Colville National Forest. How has fire changed the landscape? How might you want to go thin your forest to make it more resilient to future fires? We're starting to get into mapping drought mortality, especially in California. I'm sure you've heard about the large droughts they've had there. And actually these two are redundant. We do a lot of things where we actually also develop methods. One thing we do is we try to use the simplest measurements possible. We think they get spooked the least, but it's probably been a year's development to really be able to get in. Identifying those individual trees was pretty straightforward. It's a well-known, well-established algorithm. But putting together all the tools and the tool chains to be able to analyze this over whole areas has probably taken us about a year. So just an example, we're doing a lot to map habitat, I said it was spotted owl. The conventional wisdom in California for spotted owls is that they need 70% cover or greater. The problem with this in the national forest is also the areas which are most prone to fire or drought mortality or stress, which will lead to insect mortality. And so you can preserve these stands until something else gets them. And we're doing a comparison between 3 national forest study sites for owls with the Sequoia National Forest or National Park, where it's essentially an old growth system that has had restored fire for now almost 40 years. And you can just visually see a great difference between these two. And one of the things that we found in our research is owls do care a great deal about cover. They care a great deal about cover in tall trees. They actually select against cover in short trees. And so this potentially can give managers the freedom to come in and clear out a lot of the small trees in these landscapes, making them more resilient. We've done a lot of work, as I said, to look at fire effects in Yosemite. And one of the things that we found is looking at unburned and then areas in Yosemite that had low, moderate, and high severity fire, is the fire wasn't just coming in and thinning from below. That was our expectation. We expected that the big trees would still be there. What we found instead is that fire appears to be going in and taking out whole clumps of trees of all sizes. So the amount of cover with a moderate severity fire in, say, in tall trees and unburned on average was very similar. There's simply a lot less of it once the fire went through. So fire was coming in and removing trees in all sizes and creating the characteristic clump patterns of drier, fire-frequent forests. One thing that we're just starting to get into is into the mortality. There's now been 2 or 3 papers put out, plus we've done some preliminary studies along with the position measurement of LiDAR, the instrument will record the brightness, or what's technically called the intensity of the return. And since these are near infrared, that's what's used for terrestrial LiDAR scanning. Anything with chlorophyll in it will reflect very brightly. And so we can come in and we can look at it, and we're developing the tool chain to be able to pull up images to identify living and dead trees from a stratified random sample across entire landscapes. We do our tree recognition. Then we use the intensity here, where dark is lower intensity. We map the cover for individual trees, because if you have a snag, very often it has lost its needles, it's lost its fine branches, it's going to be more open. And then we model the probability of living versus dead, and in this preliminary study we did, we had really good accuracy assessments. Alive accuracy is 95%, dead was about 87%. And so we're developing this so we can now map mortality across entire landscapes. Another big thing we do is in natural systems is, how do you characterize all the variety of structure that's in a landscape? And of course, this changes from forest system to forest system. And so we take the data, and for those of you into remote sensing, we do an unsupervised classification to come up with structure classes. And here are 5 that we came up that we found well describe the structures across our study area in Yosemite. And we're doing this from the data, so this represents the actual diversity that's on the landscape. And then we can map it across a landscape. This happens to be a watershed in Yosemite, the Illilouette Basin, if you've ever been there or done hiking there. Okay, then just one more example project. We worked with the National Park Service. They really, as the climate gets drier, they're much more worried about fire, especially here on the east side of Mount Rainier. In the standard fuel models, the Anderson and the Scott and Bergen, you can see this little area down here in the southeast, really wasn't giving them any detail that was terribly useful to managing or planning their forest managements here. And so they put in, I think it was over 200 fuel plots, and we used LiDAR, topography, water balance to predict whether the ground fuels are likely to be high or low for 0 to 10 hour, 100 hour, 1,000 hour fuels. We tried to do straight regressions. There just isn't enough data there, but we could do high and low for each of those 3. And then also the overstory canopy structure characteristics. And this is what the fire ecologist has come up with, which is a much finer, detailed map of fuels and fire characteristics than are available from the standard fuel models. So with that, I will turn this over to Derek, and hopefully he does better with the wheel to advance the slides.
Okay. So I work both with Van and Bob McGoy, who wrote the Fusion software package, which is one of the main processing tools for LiDAR. Work with them at UW on, to some extent, the research side. My primary role is really applying LiDAR to management applications for on-the-ground forestry. I also work as a forest consultant, both for national forests and actually private landowners and so do the operational forestry as well, although not as much as I used to or would like necessarily, but try to live in a variety of worlds here. So I'm going to go through some of the sort of main applications that I think, or how LiDAR can really help sort of on the ground forest management. Will be the main focus of my talk here, and also a little bit of monitoring stuff. So the first one again is as Van mentioned, for just basic forest inventory. Again, I just want to stress that there's these direct metrics, which is, LiDAR is just measuring directly. So things like canopy cover, P95, the things that Van mentioned. And these are going to be, incredibly accurate. You can go out with your laser and in the forest, and generally the error of your laser is going to be higher than of this map. Same thing with canopy cover and whatnot. And then there's our derived metrics. So where we have our plots, and again, DNR here folks have done a lot of this work, and I know with FODAR and a whole variety of things, really sort of been leaders in developing LiDAR-based inventory. But my point here is that when we derive things like basal area and volume, or trees per acre, or QMD, our sort of standard forestry metrics, when we derive them from typically regression models, from our forest plot data and the LiDAR, these are models with error, right? And they're regressions. And things like volume and biomass tend to have pretty good models. Things like trees per acre, particularly of all trees, generally have pretty poor models. But there's always error in there. And so if you're doing things like monitoring change over time, and you're trying to see how basal area has changed, there's error every time you run that model that you just need to factor in. Of course, whenever we do a stand exam or a cruise, there's error also, right? Because we're not measuring the whole forest. So it's kind of picking your, this is from the Colville National Forest where we're doing work. So, what I've really tried to do and think about is, whenever I can use direct metrics, use those. And it takes a little bit of a shift of thinking from, just focusing on the boles of trees to, can we think about trees more in terms of height, right? Can we think about cover and height and canopy strata? Those three things LiDAR does really well versus focusing on the diameter of trees. And obviously that's tough if you're selling timber sales and you need to focus on volume, but I think there are a lot of applications where if you start to think about what LiDAR measures really well, you can avoid some of the error in there. So another question, these tree lists that Van mentioned, of course, we need to do growth and yield modeling or habitat modeling or a variety of things using FES or other models. And so the question is, how do we get tree lists from LiDAR? And I think, as Van discussed, tree lists from individual tree recognition you're going to be missing a lot of the smaller trees growing underneath other trees, or in dense young stands. The individual crowns just don't stand out as much. However, I was just down in Oregon at the Medford BLM, and they're like marching ahead with developing tree lists from individual tree recognition, and they're still trying to figure out how well it models in FES and stuff like that. And they put a diameter on trees based on the height. And so forth. So again, I'm sure there's gonna be a lot of error, but people are doing it for better or worse. There's this other approach, a nearest neighbor approach. Most people are probably familiar with the GNN data set that cover where they take FIA and other plots and impute that plot data to pixels across the whole Northwest. Using remotely sensed layers that are applicable area. I'm not going to go into the details here, but you can do the same thing with LiDAR. I don't know if you guys have experimented with that, where you have all your inventory plots, and for every pixel you use LiDAR metrics plus some other remotely sensed metrics to figure out, this pixel here, what's the closest inventory plot to it? And you just grab the tree list from that inventory plot and assign it to that pixel. And then you have a stand, and now each pixel in your stand has a tree list associated with it from an actual real plot, and you can create kind of a composite tree list from all those pixels to develop a stand tree list. If you have a really variable stand with different patches, you could divide it into a couple, stand types or substand types and go from there. So that isn't something we've done yet, but we've thought quite a bit about it and are sort of looking for a project to work on that. And again, maybe I'm sure you guys have thought about that a lot and perhaps are already doing that. So this is a project from California where we did monitoring with LiDAR. They flew pre and post treatment, and I think this is just a real tremendous opportunity. With monitoring obviously is expensive and hard, and we always talk about monitoring, adaptive management, and forestry. But it's hard to do because we're moving on to the next project, and we can go out and put in plots and remeasure plots, but that only gives us a small picture of what's going on out there. Whereas with LiDAR, you get this incredibly multi-scale picture of the change from either forest treatments or disturbances, whatever's going on. So anyway, this was a project, timber sale, where and this was a Forest Service collaborative forest landscape area, so they had a whole monitoring program and some money to go with that. This is just a very simple one, again, related to owls. You know, how did canopy cover change on a stand level? So again, summarizing all that pixel information to the polygon stand level, and we were able to show that, you know, canopy cover changed barely at all in this treatment. And that, for this was a group of stakeholders, a fairly contentious landscape area that was sort of a big deal. And so there was a lot of confidence among the stakeholders that, okay, you know, this is what's happening out there. You know, much more, I think, refined way or powerful way to look at canopy cover was to use a pixel approach and divide it up into canopy cover classes up there. Again, this was owl focused. And you can look at, okay, what is the pre-treatment canopy cover by these canopy cover classes, and what is the post-treatment canopy cover classes. And we also, as you'll see, you can do some FragStat or pattern analysis with this fairly easily as well. And you know, compared to Landstat or other stuff where you know there's a lot of error or you know, photo interpretation, you know, you can just have high confidence in this data and the accuracy of it. So just another example of wanting to know, you know, are the large trees staying in these treatments? And there was a sort of public trust issue about that, and we were able to show, you know, there was a very slight drop in the percent, you know, negligible drop. And again, instead of using diameter, people had like I don't know what the diameter, I can't remember, cutoff, sort of said, no, we're not going to do diameter because again, you have that noise, that error in the model. Let's just focus on a height threshold, and if we can get people to pick one that defines large tree from them, then our monitoring is highly accurate here. Okay, oh, here we go. So now zooming down into an actual treatment level, again, this is with those TAOs, you know, you can literally just see where all the trees that are removed and what the effect of the treatment is. And one of the things that we focus on a lot at this level is the spatial pattern, you know, the mosaic in dry forests of clumps and openings and individual trees. And so this was sort of an early attempt to quantify the change in our clump size distribution. And you know, we were able to show, and one of their questions was, are these treatments sort of overly homogenizing the forest, these fuel treatments? And we were able to show that no, you know, there was still, while they were reducing the area in these large super clumps, which were, you know, just high canopy cover patches that were out there, they were breaking some of those up and reducing the size of those, which was the goal, because it was a fuel reduction treatment. There was still a lot of you know, complexity, spatial heterogeneity out there, you know, post-treatment. Again, that was a major monitoring question. We looked at openings here. Again, this is over, you know, multiple treatment units. And when we started this monitoring, they were very focused on just their treatment units. And we said, hey, you know, really, whether it's owls or fire or whatever, is reacting to this whole project area, really this whole landscape. And so we need to look at the whole area, not just your treatment units. And bam, with LiDAR, you can, you know, it's all the data's on your computer, so you can do that. As opposed to just focusing on where you treated. So now you can see here the red are openings that got created from the treatments. And most of the openings are landings, as you can see there. But that was one of their goals, was to create more openings, but you know, they weren't sure if they were, to what extent they did. And I think they realized that they could have been more ambitious or aggressive here. Again, Van mentioned these structure classes. That are similar to structural stages. You know, I think most management agencies, you know, and I know the DNR with the spotted owl, you have a lot of habitat classifications that are basically the same ideas as structure classes. You can develop these, as Van talked about, in an unsupervised way where the data creates the classes, or you can define them. And people have taken their habitat classes and use LiDAR metrics to define those. Again, canopy cover, tree height, usually some sort of multi-story, measurement of multi-storiedness as well. And then once you have your canopy, your structure classes defined, you can look at the change in those classes over a treatment area and get a really good idea at a large scale what is going on. And so we're able to show that this class here that is associated with the California spotted owl really didn't change very much in these treatments, and that was the goal. Whereas the fire-prone class, which again Van talked about, has some large trees, but also has a lot of the intermediate and small canopy trees, that they were able to reduce both the amount and the patch size of that class, and the class of these more fire-resistant class, much more open, again with large trees, was increased, both the patch size and the connectivity, as well as the area of that. And again, that's just all sort of basic frag stats analysis. So, wanted to also talk about the recon and layout and feature idea, and this is sort of a boots on the ground forester is where I find LiDAR the most sort of exciting and useful, and it's really transformed the way I do recon. I've been using a tablet for the last few years. I finally threw away the horrible Trimble that like always crashed and had this tiny screen and with the ArcPad that I hated. And I just have a $100, 120 Asus tablet that has lasted for 4 years and is great. And I just use PDF maps and some other, and there's Arc Collector and others. So I don't know if the DNR has moved in that direction, but it's a few years ago when I talked about it, people would be like, look at me funny. Now everyone's has tablets, it seems like. So again, getting the LiDAR, whether it's the TAO maps or whatever LiDAR information out in the field, having the little blue dot showing you where you are, can really both increase the effectiveness and efficiency of doing recon for writing prescriptions, layout, logging systems, on and on. So this is just one of my first examples where I was actually putting in some experimental plots up in the Colville National Forest, and I was out there, and I quickly realized, just based on height differential, that all of these colors were western larch, and this was all lodgepole pine. These big guys were subalpine fir. And again, the LiDAR wasn't necessarily telling me that, and LiDAR doesn't do great at species identification, but because I was in the forest, there was a height differential that I could pick up on, and I've realized a lot of times you apply your own understanding in the field to the LiDAR information, and you can leverage that to really learn a lot about the landscape. So I was, after spending a little while and checking a few spots, I was able to really quickly look at this whole stand, figure out where I needed to put my plots, but also working with a silviculturist who's treating this area, they're going to remove most of the lodgepole, but wasn't really sure about how big the gaps were going to be. And we were able to sit here on GIS and get a really good idea of what the treatment was going to look like, and also if they needed to thin out the larch, really, or could they just leave the larch, or whether they needed to thin it out. And again, something that if you'd walk this stand, and most people don't have a lot of time to walk a whole stand, would have got a pretty rough idea, but combining that short walkthrough with LiDAR got a really good feel for that stand and what to do with it. This is actually from we were just down with Angus and Dan and some others down in the Hewsome block with the DNR talking about retention issues back earlier this summer. And I mentioned, are you guys using LiDAR to select your retention? And they said, well, we're sort of moving in that direction. So we went back with Jerry Franklin's class in September and worked with Alfred, I can't remember his last name. Albert, thank you, who was an amazing guy, and we got the LiDAR from the DNR. We had the class, they were taking this unit and figuring out kind of variable retention strategy, and it was just really cool to again use. You can see, this was just these monster, beautiful, huge Doug fir, and you could. This was a former unit where you can literally see all the retention, but just the ability to really quickly zero in on where the best candidates for retention, should it be dispersed, aggregated, those kinds of questions. And Albert was a little skeptical at first, but by the end of it was saying, oh yeah, I didn't really realize that there was such a huge patch of this monster Doug fir in here, because he just sort of walked the stand a couple times as you do. And an aerial photo kind of gave you that idea, but not really because of all the shadow and whatnot. So I think, I see just a clear application there to, again, not only be more efficient, but also more effective on these kinds of things. This is just another example from California. Again, here's the aerial photo, which again, still use the aerial photo. Here's the TAO layer. Immediately the big sugar pines and whatnot were jumping out at us. And then we actually combined it with the topography layer and used this topographic position index, which again can give you an idea of where you have ridges or valley bottoms, but we use it at a really fine scale here. I think this was at 5 meters, just to sort of pop out any kind of microsites, any swales, any kind of unique topographic features that might be important ecologically. You're driving any habitat features. And so we then kind of combined those two maps with the layers, and we're able to select or zero in on the kind of biological hotspots, if you will, for that unit. So again, and then we had this in the tablet, and you can go out there and visit those and kind of confirm what you're seeing and go from there. So I just wanted to end again by stressing this multi-scale nature of LiDAR, and what I think is really sort of exciting about LiDAR is that it allows us, we finally have an information source where we can move away from, I won't say move away, but we've been stuck on this, on managing at a stand level for a long time in forestry, and that's partly due to the fact that we're have kind of an agricultural model where we have stands out there, and that's what we're managing those units through time. But it's also driven a lot by information. We just didn't have high quality information at a fine scale that we could really use, and so we'd put in plots and use stand averages and whatnot to drive our management. But of course, when you're managing for a broader array of things, habitat and riparian function and all these different things that we want from our forest, we need to know what is the pattern, what is the structure at a finer scale. A lot of critters are paying attention to structure at a much finer scale than the stand. And then we also need to be able to zoom out to larger spatial scales as well for things like fire, riparian function. And so we can move from kind of a stand-centered view of the world to this multi-scale view of forest. And obviously stands and operational units are still part of this. They're still the way that we have to do operations. I'm not saying you get rid of stands, but now they're part of a multi-scale approach where you can zoom in and zoom out as you need to for different functions. And we're definitely interested in ideas for tools, or how LiDAR information can be made more useful.